So David, are we ready?
We are.
Great. So what you're doing, David, is you are turning upside down something that the world has been prescribing to since the beginning of time.
Yeah, if you go back far enough in time, for sure, age has always been this it's been a weapon. It's been a way that we controlled what everybody did and what age they did it at and why they were doing it. But it made biological sense at a certain point in history, I think. If you were a small village and you didn't have enough people who were, like the guys had to become warriors at a certain age and they had to be farmers at a certain age and the women had to have children at a certain age. And if you didn't put enough food away for the winter because everybody was doing what they were supposed to do, the village down the street could smell that fear on the wind and they'd come and take over. So age has always been this way that we control who does what until very recently. Whereas suddenly, because of the flattening forces of technology and all the amazing changes that have been going on in our world, we're all kind of free to do whatever we want, whenever we want. We don't have to be a warrior or a mother or a father or a partner or any of those things anymore. You still can, but you don't have to. So it's time for us to figure out a new way of categorizing people, because clearly age and other sorts of demographics like that are just not doing the job anymore.
But first of all, how do you think people will change their mindset and try something new? How do you plan to do that?
Well, how do I plan to do that? It's going to be I wish it would be just like an overnight switch that I could flick, like just big Frankenstein switch that I could pull down. We've built this giant database. It's the first big data tool ever that's large enough that we can profile the wants, the values, the needs, the expectations of any target audience for anything. So it's fine for us to run around and poke holes and stuff and say, demographics are over, age doesn't matter, we shouldn't be putting as much weight in gender roles as we used to. All of that stuff has to change and already has changed. Easy to be negative. It's really much more difficult to say, and I've got a solution. And so we do. We finally have the ability, thanks to algorithmic data collection technologies, we can now profile audiences for anything based on what they value. And the reason that's important is to hijack this whole thing. The reason that's important is that what we value determines what we do. So if I can tell you what an entire target audience values, we can figure out what they're going to do and what it is they're looking for and how they would like to make the next move in their life. And we can create a world for that. We can create products and services and messages based on what people value, instead of these arbitrary categories about how old they are and when their last birthday was.
How did you come upon this?
I came upon this because I had always been writing books when I had my company before. It was sort of my new business. I like to joke and say that I kind of invented thought leadership, and that was my thing before there was a term for it. Mm-hmm. So I would write a book, something that I thought that my industry would be interested in, and that would get me invited to conferences and events, and I'd get on a stage and there'd be a room full of people, and somebody in that room would end up being a client. So I sold my company about 2.5 years ago, and I said, okay, well, it worked for me there. It's time for me to write another book. Now, the previous book I'd written had been about baby boomers moving out of the suburbs and moving into urban, dense environments, and we called the book The Stackable Boomer. So I had boomers on the brain. We'd interviewed 1,000 of them. And it was about that moment in history when all those stories were coming out about millennials. Millennials this, millennials that. And you couldn't turn on the TV or read a newspaper without a story about a millennial. And apparently they're unicorns in the enchanted forest, these millennials. They need everything new and different. We've never seen anything like them before. But the stories I was reading were proving to me that they were basically looking for the same things in life that the boomers I had just studied were looking for. So I called my research team and I said, I have a hunch. I think that boomers and millennials are really the same people. They may have a few different decades between them. They may have, of course, there's different groups within each one of those age cohorts. But I think there's more in common than we would like to believe, or that the media would like us to believe. So we embarked on this giant study, and we ended up building this huge database. And now we actually have stats to prove that age is irrelevant, not just a feeling that this whole millennial thing is ridiculous, but stats to prove it. And the same thing holds true for boomers and Generation X and for any other age cohort you care to look at. The amount of similarity amongst the people within those cohorts is negligent. And yet in every boardroom around the world, we still sit down and try and figure out who a target audience for something is based on their age. Makes no sense.
Age, gender, and that sort of thing.
All of those traditional demographic things. I mean, look, there was a point where if you were a young woman and you hadn't married by the time you were 21, people would start to wonder what's going on. And if you were, yeah, exactly. I mean, the more traditional families in particular, this is still happening. And if you were a young man at a certain age and you hadn't married yet, people would start to wonder what was going on. Or if you hadn't been promoted by a certain age, they would not think you're management material. Or, you know, two guys couldn't be a couple, and they certainly couldn't adopt a child. There were rules about all of this stuff. The rules are largely over. So we've got to stop using those rules in boardrooms as if they're not, as if they're still true. You know, when we're going to spend $1 million on a campaign or on designing a new product or a service, and we make our decisions based on the system from hundreds of years ago that hasn't been updated ever since. It seems a little odd when we sit here and talk about it, but it's what we're all doing every day in boardrooms all over the world.
Let's talk about the data, the stats, the science, and the phrase that you've coined. So walk me through the numbers. How many people surveyed? How did you go about it? How do you know that it's true numbers and that sort of thing?
Okay, so there's a lot of questions buried in that question. There's 75,000 surveys. These surveys cover 40 core human values. We took those human values, that list of values from the World Value Index, the Bhutan Gross Domestic Happiness Index, other sort of proven social science tools. So we built 75,000 surveys, and it's what, if you're a data geek, a statistician, it's referred to as a random stratified statistical representation of the population of Canada and the United States. So what that means basically is we've kind of built our own little Lego model of the population of Canada and the United States. And proportionately, within the 75,000, we have the same number of men and women and black and white and Mexican and non-Mexican and rich and poor and rural and urban. So it's got the same proportions. And what that means from a statistical perspective is that any question, any kind of information that we withdraw from that database is true for the entire country. So this has never been possible before at this kind of scale. The algorithmic technologies that we've had to use in order to collect this much data and keep it that organized around so many different variables. There's 380 variables that we've tested, 380 metrics if you want. So what we're able to do with it is things like this. We decided we'd like to see how often the baby boomers agree with each other. Like how much of a group is this thing we call baby boomers that we've built the world for? Well, if we pull out just the baby boomers from this database and compare how often they agree with each other on all 380 of those different metrics, it's a lot of metrics. Across 75,000 surveys, the baby boomers agree with each other 13% of the time.
That's it?
That's it. So 87% of the time, baby boomers disagree on everything. And yet we all sit in our boardrooms and go, let's target the baby boomers. How can you do that when they only agree with each other 13% of the time? You're wasting 87% of your resources.
And you call this?
We call it Valuegraphics. And it's called Valuegraphics because I want people to think about it in the same set as demographics and psychographics. It's not replacing either of those, but it's replacing functions we've tried to make those things do that they're ill-suited for. So demographics are still very necessary. We still need to use demographics to define an audience and understand who's in that audience. But then we try and use, like, I call it business astrology. Based on those demographics, we try and guess who those people are, what they care about, and what motivates them. And really what we need is this new layer of information called Valuegraphics that tells you what that audience values, what they want and need and expect out of life. So we can stop using demographics as a way to predict behavior and focus on using it for what it's good for, which is to define the audience. Psychographics are nothing more really than a record of how people have behaved around a certain product or activity in the past. It's like a glance in the rearview mirror. You know, psychographically, this audience may be, let's talk about coffee. They may drink 3 cups of coffee a week. Psychographic fact. Doesn't tell you if you can convince them to drink tea. Valuegraphics will tell you how tolerant they are to change and whether or not you can convince them to drink tea. Very simplistic example, but an example nonetheless.
So playing devil's advocate, the way that advertising has been designed since the beginning of time, creating labels and places for people like age and gender and ethnicity and that sort of thing. And presumably advertising has worked on that model. You're saying it doesn't necessarily.
I'm saying it could work a lot better. There's an old saying in the advertising business, one of my favorite lines, I can't remember who said it. I think it may have been Leo Burnett or one of those like old guys who invented the advertising business. He said that half the money I spend on advertising is wasted, and the problem is I don't know which half. Well, I think we've kind of figured out which half, and maybe even better than half. I think that there's ways for the efficiencies around how we create messages. And it's not just about messages. It's like, let's say we're going to sell some glasses. If you know the values of the people that you're making this glassware, this tableware for, you can design it in a way that's going to tweak those values. If they're a very family-focused audience, how do you bring family into your design decisions? How do you bring family into your branding decisions? How do you bring family into your retail, your go-to-market strategy, your packaging strategy? You can take family as a filter and use that as a way to make all of those decisions so that you come up with the most amazing family-oriented set of glassware that the world has ever seen. Instead, what we do is say to ourselves, well, we're designing these glasses for people who are 25 to 36, and they're maybe starting to care about whether their glasses match. They've always had mismatched glasses. They're just starting to care about the fact that their glasses match. So now let's make some stuff up about them and figure out what these glasses should look like and what to call them, because we don't really know anything else. That's where we're at the moment.
So, okay, let's talk about, you mentioned brand. And advertising, one of the necessary things in advertising is having a brand image. So if we design ads and marketing based on value graphics, where we can't necessarily use a millennial because that's not really our target market anymore, or we can't necessarily just show a woman because that's not necessarily our target market. Now we're marketing kind of to everybody. What's the brand image that, I mean, that's really challenging ad makers.
Yeah, it's challenging until you just kind of reframe the way that you have to approach this problem. So what we're doing right now, if you take, this is the group of people that we'll call a target audience for a particular product or service or a brand. We're slicing them up into categories this way, saying there's this many men, this many women, this many this age, is rich, poor, whatever. Same group of people for that product or service. All that Valuegraphics does, it slices it this way. And says, you know what, we still have this focus. It still may be that your product is only ever going to sell to people who are between the age of 18 and 35 who make $100,000 a year and live in rural Iowa. But if you really want to make it work for them and you want to own that market, you need to understand that this is their values, regardless of where they fit in that continuum around that particular target audience. So it just gives you that extra layer of information to decide, should this thing be black or should it be white? Well, let's look at our values. The values of this group are honesty, truth, and environmentalism. Actually, the answer is this thing should be green. And honesty and truth, why don't we not make this thing in a way that where we have to hide any of our production methods or distribution channels? Why don't we tell the whole story of inception to market around this product? These people care about those things. They want honest products. Let's tell them that whole story. Let's make it green, and let's make it indestructible because their other core value is family. So we've now designed a product specifically for a set of values that may only ever sell to this particular demographic, but it's the right thing for the group of people within that demographic that we're trying to talk to.
And you've always been about truth in marketing. You've written books. You've got tremendous credibility in business circles because of those books. And now you're talking about a different type of truth that you're trying to uncover and share with the world.
You know what? I hadn't made that connection, but you're very right. The very first book I wrote was called Sell the Truth. And it was when social media was just starting to peek over the horizon, and businesses were largely writing it off and saying, this is ridiculous. This is a fad. This isn't gonna stick around. And I looked at it and I thought, you know, what this is doing is kind of flattening the hierarchy around storytelling. It's giving everybody the ability to be a storyteller. It democratizes the media. So that means our customers are going to be able to complain a lot faster than they've ever complained, and a lot more publicly than ever before. The people who love our brands are going to be able to tell their friends a lot more easily. My red flags went up as soon as I saw this thing starting to take off. So my first book was kind of a warning signal for business to say, we need to be paying attention to this. I think my book was maybe 2 years too early because I had a lot of fights. I got up on stages and people were like, that's ridiculous. Twitter's for my grandchildren. Not so much anymore. In retrospect, I hope some of those folks remember those conversations.
That is the stuff to me that lends to your credibility. You were on to something early on, and you've been building on it and evolving it.
Yeah, and so you're right. This is my fourth book now, and they all have had that sort of a consistent theme in their own funny way. Each one of them has been about trying to find a better way and solve some problems, and to use truth and honesty and all those horrible hackneyed words that we're all tired of hearing, transparency, authenticity, as a way to help people make decisions about the things they're going to decide to do. Up until I sold my company a few years ago, we'd focused almost exclusively on real estate. And in that case, that's the most important, not to mention most expensive, but most important purchase anyone's ever going to make in their life. It's not just an asset class. It's the place where you have fights with your loved one and then you make up, and where you celebrate birthdays and anniversaries, and you have your friends over, have children. And for us as an industry, when we were working specifically in the real estate industry, for us as an industry to not be recognizing that level of responsibility that we have was a bit of a mission for me. I wanted to make sure we were doing everything we could to help people make the right choice and get the right people into the right homes. And as the marketing guy in that whole giant massive industry, our marketing company was very much about trying to tell the truth, sell the truth, helped our developer clients figure out how to make people happier in their homes in the long run. And so now this book is basically the same theme. Thank you for pointing that out. I hadn't thought about that. But now it applies to everything. Now the database is so big that this is useful to people in healthcare and retail and, yes, real estate, government services, manufacturing. I've yet to find an industry or a situation where knowing more about what your audience cares about isn't useful. It's probably the most important part of knowing how to move forward in any kind of company or organization. What do the people in our audience care about?
Advertising is story. At its fundamental core, it's story. And as humans, we crave story. And what I hear you say, I've read the manuscript, I've read the news release, I know who you are, I've followed your career, I've read your books. You're basically saying to advertisers, tell a story, and don't label people and just have like age group, demographic, boom, 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 but values are a story about somebody, what they believe in, what they live, what they breathe, how they conduct themselves, etc. It's a story.
Yeah, very much so. I think the thing that's interesting about Valuegraphics and this particular book and this data set that we've built, this big data tool, is it's the first time that we're aware of where there's been a purpose-built data set large enough to help you determine what story. It's true. Stories are the currency of any relationship. You and I are trading stories. We've known each other for a long time. We've traded stories ever since we met. And that's how we become better and better friends. We trade stories. It's currency. But companies trying to figure out which of the 100 things they would like someone to know about their whatever, that's a decision that's largely been left to opinion and guesswork. And sometimes worse, sometimes it's left to small p politics around the boardroom table and somebody banging their fist and saying, I'm the senior vice president in charge of something, and so we're going to do it my way. And then millions of dollars get spent. We've spent so much time thinking about all the details of putting a product together and getting this all ready to go. And then this biggest of decisions, what's our story, gets left to opinion, guesswork, politics. It's a very, very difficult thing to try and solve, though, because we haven't had a system, we haven't had a tool, we haven't had a data set large enough in order to do this with any kind of predictability. So I'm super excited that Valuegraphics is here now. in the book that's coming out in the next little while about Valuegraphics. The name of the book, by the way, is We Are All the Same Age Now, and it's about this data set we've built called Valuegraphics. We give away a tool in there. It's 10 short questions you can ask any audience. I like to be silly about it and say, if you have a hot dog stand, you can ask these 10 short questions of everybody who comes and buys a hot dog. And after you got maybe 100 people to answer these 10 short questions, you kind of know what the valuegraphic profile of your audience for your hot dog buyers are. So that's how convinced I am that this thing is important, that we want to give the tool away. Now, yes, there's a commercial side to this. If companies would like more precise information than the sort of top 10 quiz that we've put together, which is sort of the front cover of Glamour magazine or something, it's that version of science, then of course they can come to us and we'll give them very, very precise, detailed information about who they're talking to, what their values, wants, needs, and expectations are. But this test that's in the book, these top 10 questions that we can ask any audience, it's still statistically superior to what we're doing now, which is we're targeting boomers, we're targeting female millennials. That's as broad-based as we are sitting around doing. So at least these 10 questions are making us think about things in terms of values, and values are always going to win, hands down, over demographics in a boardroom.
And what are some of the values you have discovered that we share across the age?
Well, there's 40 core values that are represented in the database, and these are proven sociological lists of values that we collected from a variety of different sources. If you sort of know these 40 things about a group of people, you kind of have their DNA. You sort of know who they are as a human being, how they think, how they feel, what scares them, what excites them, all of those things. These 40 values are an agreed to list in the scientific world. But some interesting things that came out of using that and testing that against those 75,000 people, the number one value across the board, regardless of age, socioeconomic status, any other way we can slice and dice the data, the number one value is belongingness. We all just want to belong. We all want to feel like we're part of something bigger than just our own small little lives. We all want to feel like we have a group, that we have a tribe, that we have a place where we're welcome and where people know who we are. I think it's why we're seeing the resurgence of things like private clubs. Like the Soho Club is a perfect example. It's a concept that 10 years ago I don't think would have gotten off the ground. And today Soho Clubs and WeWork and all of these sorts of membership-based organizations where really what they're selling is an excuse to get together. That's what they're selling, is belongingness. It makes perfect sense. Think about people in their yoga classes who would not miss that 5 o'clock yoga class with that particular instructor that they've been going to for the last 2 years. Because that instructor is better than any other instructor in the world? No, because they belong there. That's what we're looking for. That's I think that's fascinating and kind of hopeful, really, in this world that we're in right now.
And a bit sad, because I think that we live in a more insular society than we ever have. And people are on their phones and not making eye contact, or smile contact, as I like to call it. And so at our core as humans, I'm not surprised that that's the number one value, because that's what we've lost. As time goes on, we're losing that to technology. And you found it, and that brings me to my next question about technology. It's funny now what turns, what changes or shifts how people think in the boardroom, what they're doing, how they pitch, is usually a technological advancement. But you haven't really presented a technology. You're kind of a grassroots. We took a survey, a rather big survey. We actually talked to people. This is not something artificial in your hand, an app, etc., that's going to change your life. This is actual information from real people that's going to change your life if you will allow it into your boardroom. So isn't that neat that you've done something just very human basic rather than technologically based?
Yeah, I mean, it's in some respects, I think one of the opening lines in my book is that, I found something, just hello, I found something rather simple, incredibly complex to get here, but it is rather simple.
And you said yet profound, or something like that.
It was a challenge to put this together, the amount of detail, the amount of rigor around the statistical analysis, the collection of data, the validation of the inputs, the way the data is put together and thought about and how it's analyzed. It's incredibly complex. It's taken me 2.5 years to be able to talk about it because I'm not a sociologist. Thankfully, I've got a sociologist working at a university in New Zealand who's my research partner on this, and he's doing the heavy lifting on that side of things. But it's taken me 2.5 years to figure out how to be comfortable talking about this stuff. I've had to pick up this vocabulary and understand what it is to be a social scientist. However, you're right. What comes out of this is super simple. Things like what we're all most seeking, what we're all most engaged with, what we're all hunting for all day long, is we just want to belong. I mean, it's poetic almost, but it comes from this rigorous data. And that's what makes it so exciting, is it's true. It's poetry that's true.
What are the types of questions you asked in the survey? And also, a double-ended question, what are the types of questions you asked and how did you dole the survey out to people?
So let's talk about let's go with the how we doled the survey out question first. So the highest paid targeting scientists in the world who understand how to make algorithms that are capable of placing an ad on the Facebook page of a woman who lives in Topeka and drives a Lincoln Continental from 1973 and has a poodle. We can get that precise with where those ads go because we have all these scientists at Facebook and at LinkedIn and at Twitter and all the other different social media channels. Essentially what all those companies are targeting companies. So what we've done is we've used that same targeting technology as a way to make sure that our questions are being asked to people based on certain demographic categories so that we could build that thing we talked about earlier, the random stratified statistically representative sample of the population. So when we had enough 18-year-old women from urban centers in the South, we stopped showing them questions so that we weren't getting too many of them. So we were able to control who came in. Now, the kinds of questions. There's a thing about surveys, survey bias is what it's referred to as, and it's a fairly broad term, but it can mean things like, if I ask you, is your family important? You're gonna go, of course my family's important, because that's what you're supposed to say. But is your family really important? I have to kind of come through the back door and ask you some other questions and find out. So I'll give you an example that comes from the book. One of the surveys went out in waves that were sort of thematically grouped. And one of them was about sports and fitness and health and wellness and those sorts of things. So we found people who had talked about a particular sport on their, in their social media feeds. So let's say you're a huge soccer fan. So you'd get a little thing that showed up on your Facebook page or your Twitter account that said, hey, we're trying to understand soccer a little better, and we want to talk to some really big soccer fans. Would you mind answering a couple quick questions? And because you're a soccer fan, you go, sure, I'll do that. And so we ask you a few questions to make sure you are who you say you are. And then we ask you a few questions like, do you go to soccer games and live or do you just watch them on TV? Well, I go live. And do you have a favorite team? I do. And if your favorite team is out of the game, out of the season after 2 games, would you switch alliance to a different team? No, I'd never do that. It's like this one team that's it. If they're not there, I'm not interested. Do you go with your family? Do you go with your friends? Do you spend money when you're there? Do you drink when you're there? Do you have a jersey? Do you travel? All these kinds of questions about soccer. So you're having a great time filling out this little survey, but really what you're telling us about is loyalty. You're telling us about your relationship to your family, about your recreational time, about your spending habits, about your attitudes towards alcohol, about your attitudes towards your friends, about your prioritization of your friends and your family around this one thing that you're very interested in, which is soccer. That's the information that we get out of you by asking you about soccer. So then that's all codified and put into the appropriate slots, and that's the kind of data we can feed back. Not how people feel about soccer, although we have that, but how people feel about their family as it compares to how they feel about their friends. That's the sort of contextual softness, if you will, that this data can bring to the table. It's not just, 72.3% of the people that we talked to said they like asparagus. It's like, no, it's about who we are as humans. It's softer than that. It's more organic than that. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. And I want to know, you talked earlier about, boomers disagree a certain percent of time and so disagrees. Give that to me just in a short sentence about what you saw in terms of the disagreement.
Boomers, when we look at them across the entire 75,000 surveys in the Valuegraphics database, Remember, we have 380 different variables in the database that we tested. And boomers only agree with each other 13% of the time, which is shocking. It means 87% of the time boomers disagree on everything. Generation X agrees with each other 11% of the time. So they really don't agree on anything, and yet we still target them. And millennials, this enchanted unicorns in the magic forest that we're supposed to change our world for, and new kinds of ways of working and compensation packages and products and services. Everything has to change for the millennials. They only agree with each other 15% of the time. So 85% of the time, millennials disagree on everything. How can we possibly make policy changes, change our companies, invent products for a group of people who disagree on everything? There's nothing to shoot for. If you spend $1 trying to target millennials, you're wasting 85 cents. Why would you do that? It just doesn't make any sense. Age is just ridiculous. My little hashtag is the age of age is over. We need to stop thinking about these demographic stereotypes from days gone by and start thinking about what we care about and what we share as human beings and the values that bring us together instead of the demographics that push us apart.
What are the top 5 value graphics?
The top 5 value graphic profiles? Okay, so in the book we actually talk about top 10, and there we refer to them as value graphic archetypes. And before we talk about any one of them in particular, let me just qualify this a little bit. This huge 3-dimensional pile of data we refer to sometimes as a bubble bath of data, where every bubble is a data point. So if you take the top 10 biggest peaks of bubbles, those are the archetypes. It's an interesting way to talk about this, but no group or individual is ever going to be just one of these things. So it's kind of a false construct. It's better than what we're using now, boomers and millennials and whatever, but it's not incredibly accurate for us to say this particular archetype is what you are part of this archetype. You're part of this one and a part of this one and maybe a little bit of this one. That's the way it all works. However, that being said, top 10 archetypes. I think some of the most interesting ones for me were things like workaholism. So yeah, exactly. I mean, most people are like, I thought we were over that. But in fact, there's a group of people, one of the top 10 groups in this giant data set, who are proud of being workaholics. They do not want our pity. They are not upset that they self-report as much as 80 hours a week in the office. Very, very driven by status, very, very driven to protect their families into the future. They do like public accolades, and they don't mind other people having accolades as well, but they're particularly interested in other people having accolades if it's recognized that they had a hand in helping that person achieve whatever it is they achieved. So we know a whole bunch of stuff about this particular group, and it's a great way to sort of talk about the kinds of information that comes out of the database. Another one of my favorites that I was so glad to see show up in the top 10 is a group we call the Environmental Assembly. And this is a group of people who believe that the planet is the #1 concern that we all need to be focused on all day, every day. Some of the things we learned about them that I thought were quite surprising. It's the only group, and not just the top 10 archetypes, but any client work we've done, any specific commissioned work we've done, it's the only group that shows incredibly high levels of personal responsibility. So they don't believe that the issues that the planet are facing is something that we are going to solve. They believe it's something that they have to solve. They aren't as interested in group solutions. They don't vote, very infrequently vote. What they're more interested in is how can I change my behavior today so that I'm doing my part to reduce my carbon footprint. So environmental organizations that are trying to activate this group need to understand that it's not about group effort. As far as they're concerned, it's tell me what I can do in the next 10 minutes to make things just a little bit better. And if we all do that, we're all going to get to a better place in a better way. The other thing I found quite interesting about that group is we asked, as we do with many of the surveys found out, but in this case, this one came up to the top around this profile. How do you like, what's the most credible source of information? If we're trying to get the word out to you about something, what's the best way to reach you? Well, the Environmental Assembly said social media, not interested. In fact, they're very, not anti-technology, but they're certainly, as long as their phone's working, they don't care about getting a new phone. They're not technology focused. But they said, and this is what I thought was quite interesting, the best way to reach them, the most credible source, is direct mail, which for the environmental assembly, I thought was a little odd. But it makes sense, I guess. We know that they tend to be more educated than the benchmark study. They tend to be looking for more information. They're looking for personal ways that they can impact the planet. Write me a letter and tell me what I can do. There's nothing more personal than that. So they're driven by those kinds of cues and touch points. That's incredibly valuable if you're trying to activate the environmental assembly, to know those things and not be running around spending your time and money doing other things.
What's the one thing you want people to know?
The one thing I would like people to know. There's a problem, and it's a big problem in our world right now, that we're still using incredibly outdated demographic stereotypes to build everything around us. It begins in a boardroom with a conversation about defining who the audience is based on outdated stereotypical demographics. And that the solution is not just about finances, although it will help companies make more money and spend their money more efficiently. That's the fuel in this engine. The solution is going to lead us to a world where everything around us has been built for people based on what those people care about, not when their birthday was. And if we can get there, if we can even move the needle a little bit there, so that all the things in our world are built with this notion of doing it for what people care about, what they're motivated by, what they think is the most important thing in their day and in their life, I think it's going to be a much better world. And right now, we need these things. This is a time in history where there's so many forces that are determined to push us apart and to create divisions. I think Valuegraphics can be one little part of how we can bring ourselves together and organize ourselves into groups and create products for people who share human values, that most basic of all building blocks of who we are as people.
Yeah, it's about saying, hey, we're not all that different.
No, we're so much more alike than we are different. Regardless of how old you are, or rich you are, what color your skin is, what part of the country you come from, there's going to be people in all of those categories who you are nothing alike, and people in all of those categories that you're basically twins with. That's the lesson. It's not that we're all the same, it's that we're all, there's people of all kinds who are the same as all of us. And I think that's the big message.